Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the System 2 podcast. I have the pleasure of speaking with Ben, who's the CEO at Revelio Labs. Ben is also an author, a professor. He has a very interesting history. And thank you so much, Ben, for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
So, Ben, you think a lot about jobs. You recently posted about how the AI enthusiasm is driving a jobless stock market boom. How do you feel about what AI is doing to the job market?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot to kind of unpack there. I don't think AI is displacing workers. I think that's not the right interpretation of what's going on and why there's something of a jobless boom. And when we talk about the jobless boom, I'm really talking about the boom in the stock market and a really very tough, really bad labor market, at least in the US. So those two things are happening simultaneously, and it seems like both are kind of happening because of AI to some degree. So speculation in the stock market being because of AI, that's not a big surprise. That's like, a huge, you know, huge thing that people are thinking about as they're speculating on the future of productivity, but also it's creating a lot of you know, new investment in data centers and whatever. So like that's the least speculative thing, that the job market boom is somehow related to AI. The tough job market, I think, is also kind of related to AI, but I don't think it's through direct displacement. I think it's really anticipatory. So a lot of companies, they see AI, they know it's a big deal, demos well, they don't really know how to implement it. And so there's some kind of wait and see mentality in how business leaders are thinking about, like, what are the types of workers we're going to need? What are the skills we're going to need? How is the work going to be reorganized in an eventual, state where AI is just a big part of our workflow? So I think there's just a lot of uncertainty about what this technology will ultimately be. So I think a lot of hiring is kind of on the back burner in the short to medium term.
There's an article today in the journal about the headline, the title is about the American rebellion against AI, and talks about people sharing that anxiety around the future in the job market. And it's now turning into a bit of a rebellion against some of these tech leaders. What do you make of that? Do you feel like there is going to be more of a backlash as it relates to jobs, or at the very least, the perceived like uncertainty around people's careers and jobs?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think there's always an element of human rebellion against technology since the Luddites, where we're going to be smashing the machines, just because we view them as, competitive with humans. So I think that is a little bit backward, but unavoidable. There's in some circles, people like the idea of kind of reclaiming the history of the Luddites and saying, hey, they were actually pretty rational and, AI did cause displacement and all that. But I personally think that's not quite the right read, but it's gonna happen anyway. There's gonna be some rebellion. And that is just, has to happen. We have to suffer through that to some degree. But I think it's especially bad because the pioneers of AI, the leaders in this technology, have been so, I think, attentive to broad anxiety about technology. So, we have, the CEO of Anthropic talking about how, all, half of white collar work is going to be, decimated. Um, and, thinking of themselves as kind of the white knight who's going to save us and get UBI or something. And it seems like there's some effort among the frontier AI labs and among the Silicon Valley elite to kind of position themselves as both the harbinger for technology and the savior from technology. And I think that framing really falls flat outside of Silicon Valley because these like Silicon Valley people I think are seen by the masses as being really poor stewards of how technology infiltrates society. Now we see, some negative effects from social media and all these things. And I think the general public kind of feels like these aren't the people we want to herald in a new wave of technology because they're not careful with societal implications and stuff like that. And there's still this reputation as, these, reckless cowboys who just, move fast and break things. It just seems like the wrong people we want to be ushering in this new wave. So I think that there's some sentiment that is just like, all right, maybe we're okay with technology, but not from these guys. So I think that probably doesn't help also.
On that note, which jobs are recession proof or which jobs are AI proof?
Yeah. Okay. So it's a good question. So I think there's a couple ways to interpret AI proof and recession proof as kind of distinct topics. So I would say, just talking about recessions, there are some sectors of the economy that are more pro-cyclical. Like construction is always, a good example of something that, goes up when the economy is booming, goes down when the economy is not doing well. Recruiting is another one of those things that, when people are hiring, they need a bunch of recruiters. When they're not hiring, recruiters are the first to go. So whereas I think finance is a great example of something that's kind of not quite counter-cyclical, but like a little bit less correlated to the success of the economy. At least in the world of hedge funds where you and I operate that are mostly kind of market neutral. Yeah, it's nice to be market neutral. I think in our space, we're both in the data business. I think that to me feels a little bit counter-cyclical because when times are tough, people want more certainty around what's going to happen. They want more visibility into the economy. So I think to the extent that we can provide information, so information businesses I think are kind of countercyclical. I mean, those are just the industries that are kind of recession proof. And of course, they have a different mix of occupations. Healthcare is another great example of something that is kind of not correlated with the cyclical economy, booms and busts. Um, so those seem to be kind of recession proof. In terms of what's AI proof, now I think there's two ways to think about that. You could think of the the tasks and occupations that are not exposed to AI. So just really don't touch it. So think like preschool teachers or someone who busses tables, things where you need to have some like nimbleness or some human element, therapists or something, something where embedding AI or embedding technology would not get that far. There are a lot of jobs that are also very, very messy, to quote Luis Garicano, who's coming out with this book called Messy Jobs, where, as you get into more complex, abstract topics, like running a company, there's a lot of moving parts to be aware of at all times. And that is not something that's vulnerable to automation. So things that just don't touch technology are one way to think about those that are safe. Another way to think about this is that you may have occupations that have some of their tasks that are kind of exposed to AI automation. But those are maybe not the tasks that align to their specific areas of expertise. So if you and I, have to do a lot of bureaucratic paperwork or filing taxes or whatever, and that is vulnerable to automation. Now, that may mean that our job changes, but if the most high value parts of our job are maybe complementary to that work, then actually we are better than protected. We are accelerated by technology. So so I think the real question of like who is in a good place when this wave of technology hits, I think that the question is what are the parts of their job that will be automated, and is the remaining part of their job something that is very high value or very low value? So a counter example that I'm kind of paraphrasing David Otter here, who has a good example, who likes to give this example of taxi drivers. When Google Maps and Waze and all these mapping softwares came out, a lot of their specialized skill, specialized expertise was degraded. So it used to be that taxi drivers would kind of know all the routes in a city and they'd kind of memorize this map, and that was really a source of high value. Now, any Joe Schmo can step into a car and do a perfectly good job. So that's a role where technology actually, kind of substituted for their high value expertise rather than complemented their high value expertise. So, yeah, I think, we need to think about like what parts of our jobs are, associated with the things that are uniquely human, what requires empathy, opinions, creativity, leadership, inspiration, all these things that are unrelated to AI, and think, are those complementary to the execution of AI related tasks, of summarization, of things that AI is really good at?
I wonder if we can just explore a hypothetical. In my math background, I often think what happens in the limit is just like an extreme case, and on either side, and then the reality is going to be somewhere in between. But I think having these limit exercises can be helpful. And what do you think happens if the cost of labor in the limit goes to zero, or labor is now free, and there's including physical labor? Let's just say we have robots that can do anything. We've seen this historically, right? Like you've seen slavery, and what for all its evils, what slavery has been able to achieve, everything from like the pyramids to like the Roman Empire. These things relied so heavily on labor being free, or the cost of it essentially being free. And I'm curious what do you think that could do to society if we all live in a world where anyone can essentially have access to virtually unlimited slave labor to build whatever project that they have? What could society achieve with that?
Yeah, it's a fun exercise. I mean, in this model, I think we're assuming that productivity is high, that productive output is high, and that value kind of accrues to capital, or does it accrue to? I mean, someone's going to get that value. So someone's going to get rich off this. Is it everyone? Is it kind of? Do we live in this like? I mean, that's maybe a question within the question of like, what are the societal political implications of that world? I mean, in our current state, that value would accrue to capital, which would have a lot of implications for inequality, obviously. But it's hard for me to imagine that is a sustainable equilibrium. It seems like there would have to be some, in this in this very extreme case, I think I'd still expect there to be some pressure toward like broad distribution or broad allocation of this technology. So let's assume that we're in a world where it's kind of open access, and even the very poorest people have access to produce whatever they wanted, or consume whatever they wanted. So one thought is that we'd be able to produce amazing things, um, and things that would probably shock us. I mean, there was this quote in 1900 that someone at the patent office said, everything that can be invented has been invented. And that was in 1900. So like, there's so much that's happened since then, and our lives have transformed in ways that at least one person completely could not have predicted. So I think we'll produce things that are just extraordinary. And we can speculate on what that does for health and for medicine and travel and space travel and whatever. But I think, suffice it to say, it'll look extraordinary. Um, the downside of that is, oh well, if everyone just like lives a life of leisure, then are they going to feel fulfilled? And what are people going to do with their time? Are we all just going to be like these zombies in like that movie Wall-E, just like sitting around getting fat, drinking Slurpees? And maybe that's a world that is not so crazy in that scenario. To me it sounds like a depressing world. But if you're living in a very poor country and living in extreme poverty, maybe that world sounds like a big improvement. I don't know. I mean, it's a fun exercise, but I'm a little nervous about like speculating on these like to the limit scenarios. Even though like your point is right that these are kind of interesting cases, but there's so much that can happen in between then. So it's like it's hard to speculate.
I was thinking about that because we have seen examples of these limits happen. Like one example that comes to mind is plastics. Like plastics are essentially free. And if you look at what happens to a good where the cost of producing it is zero because it's a byproduct of something else, and like our entire world right now would be so different if plastics weren't free, where you can literally throw away a cup or a Ziploc. Like we're throwing away these products. I remember when my so I was born in Romania, and we did not have plastics when I was growing up. And when they first got introduced, my grandfather would store every single like bottle of Coke that he'd buy, and he was fascinated by just like how you can like twist the top onto it, and it was like a perfect seal of a liquid. It's something you take for granted, but before that, when you had glass bottles and corks, like that stuff leaked, and if you turn it upside down or whatever, there's like temperature changes. And he was like, "This is a phenomenal product." And it's like, I didn't understand why people are throwing it away.
Yeah.
And so, like, objectively speaking, plastics are a phenomenal product, and we're throwing it away because they're essentially free. And so everything from like medicine to computers to cars to everything is now a world would have been so different if we had to spend $100 for a bottle, because it's like that much better than the glass comparison. And so yeah, it is interesting to think about, and yeah, and then on the labor side, like one of the things that I've been looking at, I just came back from a trip in Europe, and you look at the craftsmanship of these old buildings, the cathedrals, the castles, and these were again built with a lot of like essentially very cheap, if not slave labor, because you could not do it otherwise, or you had to have the monopoly of a monarch to be able to fund those types of projects. And today, like, you don't have a stonemason that can fix the gargoyle that was broken on one of these things, right? There's a very small select group of people that can actually go in and do repairs on these structures because the techniques have been lost. And you've been lamenting these like lost, techniques in the arts and crafts. But yeah, if you can now program that and any robot can build whatever cathedral, imagine just kind of what residential architecture could look like. If I now no longer need to, use the same 2x4 because it's all standardized, and I can get my own, yeah, my own cobblers, my own stonemasons, carpenters to build all sorts of products for me.
Yeah. It's such a good example. I mean, I really like this plastics example, but I also wonder like if there's going to be some just human appetite for things that are just more scarce just because they're scarce. And maybe that will be human expertise. I mean, I think of, I mean, plastics are close to free and digital goods are essentially free. And we have so many digital goods. And then, what was that thing that came out? This like stupid thing where people were like buying memes on the blockchain. What are
The
the names?
NFTs,
NFTs.
yeah.
Yeah. NFTs are just like, it's an example of trying to create scarcity in a digital world. And like people paid money for something that was artificially scarce. And it just kind of made me think, oh wow, people really like the fact that it's scarce because it's scarce. And in economics, we think so much about like how we want more abundance, we want more consumable goods and services. And there's still an appetite for things that are just scarce, even if it's artificial. And I think of like sometimes if you go to a craftsman who makes plates or bowls or whatever, you can tell they're kind of made by a human because they're like a little worse. And that commands a premium. So people pay extra for something that was made by hand. And it's got some novelty to it. It feels human and we like it. And I wonder if that is going, if that's also something that will be in demand, if something that was created not through AI, something that was just built in a way that someone put their humanity into it. Now, that seems like something people will pay for. So I can imagine that there's like still going to be a thriving industry of that. Maybe be very thriving in an age where production becomes easier and easier.
I want to pull on that thread. I think that's very, very interesting. So on this trip to I was in Romania, and my co-founder came with me, and we're we took a train through the countryside and we saw a bunch of small factories in these like smallish towns that were abandoned. And these were, it could have been whatever, your local shoemaking factory, all sorts of these local goods that have now gone extinct because it's much cheaper to buy these products at Walmart. And one of the things that we're talking about, exactly to your point, is like, can the AI revolution bring back the small business or the local town artisan craftsman and enable them to produce things that are customized to that community because they know that community much more? And will then, to exactly to your point, will that community respond better to say, okay, yeah, these goods are actually, like, I'm willing to pay a premium. And maybe that premium isn't so high anymore because the technology can be that much more productive and reduce those costs. So I wonder, like, yeah, like in one of these scenarios, is Walmart in trouble because we now have the rise of smiths and cobblers in towns that can produce all these like custom goods from your custom house?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think about this question a lot because, one thing that's really not, I don't know if we should take for granted is that in our economy today, firms are the organizing unit of labor. And if you think back to, a couple hundred years ago, you had your milkman and shoemaker and, like cobbler, the matchmaker, the butcher, the brewer, the candlestick maker. You had all these artisans that were essentially operating their own independent firm, and they were like a one person company. And when you transacted with this company, you transacted with the person. You knew that, oh, I'm going to get my bread from this baker who has a name and a face. And, you know, we that's declined tremendously. And now we have these like faceless corporations that are, I mean, not always faceless. Sometimes you have some, charismatic executive that kind of, presents the brand of a company. Or, they create their own brand. But for the most part, they're some faceless entity that you buy from. Like, I actually don't know who runs Walmart. Probably most people in the world don't know, unless you're like kind of in the know. But like, there's so much value in mass production, like integrated supply chains, and just like returns to scale generally, that we get so much more efficiency from shopping at a Walmart that can source from all over the world, that can like, have all these distribution centers, they can deliver, you can, have this great shopping experience. And it's really nice to have everything you need in one place. Side rant a little bit. When you go to the UK, you don't have supermarkets to the same degree as you do in the US. If you want meat, you got to go to a butcher. If you want cheese, you got to go to a cheese store. It's a different experience. Personally, I think there's like a lot of advantages to being able to go to one place. You go to a Whole Foods and you get everything you want. So, but the question is like, what are could we live in a world where single entities, single people essentially operate their own firm that can be as competitive as some massive company? So I think ultimately that kind of comes down to coordination costs as like the one lever that determines whether things are organized by like smaller entities, maybe even one person as the extreme case of a very small entity versus like these mega corporations. So if you are a freelancer, you're essentially operating your own business and you are transacting your work with someone. So, the freelancer of today is the, milkman of 200 years ago. And now a freelancer can actually produce quite a lot. Like you can make an application, a website or whatever through one person, through these tools that allow us to be very productive if we're like, a smart, capable person. So I think the value that a single person can produce is expanding. It's a little unclear about what happens to coordination at a large firm. You can make the case that as the production of tasks become cheaper, then people start operating at more abstract levels. So instead of managing specific tasks, you start managing entire workflows or entire sets of workflows to be able to produce more of a holistic, abstract set of products. And maybe while there are increased returns to individuals, there are also increased returns to firms, and kind of they balance each other out, and we still see the same mix. Or you could make the case that as AI does more execution of tasks, we have, the coordination burden between workers actually increases. It's harder to know what people are working on, how it integrates with something else, and that coordination that happens within firms actually becomes too costly. And, operating a big giant organization may just be a lot less efficient, may just have more friction than operating smaller entities. I mean, you could also, make the case that larger organizations are just going to be slower to adopt technology because of bureaucracy and lack of adaptability and all that. So I think on net, I think I kind of agree with your presumption that we'll see more operation, more productivity kind of at the micro level, and maybe less so at these like big giant organizations. But I don't know if yeah, I don't have like a lot of conviction about that.
Yeah. No, it's fun to just think through these questions because they can also point to things that could be built as putting on my entrepreneur hat, what could be built either to help these enterprises or these individual freelancers to achieve more. And so going back to the example of that factory, I think there's also something to be said about the physical nature of this. Right now, a lot of the talk is just around the software AI versus if you can now do things in the physical world and like what would a factory in this kind of an environment look like when everybody can come up with their own ideas and it's very easy to do like the thinking, the design, the even like the marketing to some extent, the branding of a new product. And if you can combine that with, but it's going to be significantly harder, at least in the beginning, to produce that, the physical good. And so, and it's more capital intensive to the point that you're making earlier about how these things require a lot more capital, either to buy the robots, the equipment, the land, et cetera, the raw materials to produce these goods. So, like, could there be a business model where you revive some of these small factories in small towns, but instead of having them be very specialized in one component of a supply chain, to have it integrate very easily with like dozens of freelancers in that town that each want to produce their own goods and they don't need to produce them at a mass scale. But they, it's not one either. It's like it's somewhere between a prototype and a million units. If I just need 200 pairs of shoes for my town, can I do that in some new kind of like production environment that is tailored at like, yeah, doing like medium size, small to medium size runs, but from beginning to end, a little bit higher cost, but maybe that's okay because that adds to the scarcity of it, which makes these goods more interesting.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what you think that does to distribution. Like if buyers become flooded with great options, how do they differentiate? I mean, let's say anyone can make shoes or whatever it is really well, really easily. I mean, and you're a distributor or you're a buyer. How do you know? It's basically first come first serve, or do we like have this commodity market where there's more of a exchange or clearinghouse or something? I mean, I don't know what to make of the
Yeah.
implications on how these markets are even organized.
Yeah, and I have a couple of thoughts on that. I think and we are, to your point, seeing that in digital goods where anybody can create digital goods. And what has been a consequence of that is the frequency with which things go viral and with which like many other things just don't get any views. So you have, and part of that is driven by quality, but it's also driven by if you understand the algorithm, the things that propagate this. So I was reading another article about some Japanese apparel, not even companies, like basically, yeah, like these craftspeople in Japan that are making very custom things, and they're experimenting with things that look like denim, but they're actually silk. So the materials are very different. And you look at it, like, oh, that's just a pair of jeans, but then you touch, it's like, oh, holy shit, this is silk. And so
That's amazing.
they have you become much more creative because what H&M and Zara and all these fast fashion companies have done is this is very fast, and therefore you have to be very efficient with your fabrics, and you have to be able to churn things very quickly. But it's like, oh, we've lost a lot of the innovation and diversity. This has been the argument against Walmart for forever, how it squashed the diversity of like going to, if you go to two different butchers, you're going to end up with like very different kinds of meat than the same stuff that gets sold at Walmart. Yeah, so in a world where there's a ton of diversity, you're going to have a lot more creativity and driven by the ease with which social media, you can discover stuff. I can easily see some of these products just go viral very quickly. But at the same time, I also think it's going to be hard to, sorry, it's going to be hard to sustain that. Where if you now are a brand that's producing like your LVMH and you were consistently producing high quality clothing in a world where like the next up and coming designer comes up with a cool new fabric and their stuff goes viral and assuming that they can produce that quantity at scale, it's going to be much harder to sustain these large companies. Which I also think is that's a very interesting point that you're making around will the advantages of large enterprises start to diminish because of all these changes, which as someone who's running a smaller firm, I would love nothing more to be the
Yeah,
age of the underdog.
sounds great. Yeah. Yeah, maybe it's hopeful thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, and that raises so many other questions. Okay, like to the point we were making earlier is like, well, what kind of companies could you start in a world where, yeah, you have a lot of like one-off entrepreneurs trying to do things? What other services can you provide for them to be able to achieve that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think as someone who operates a small company, I feel like there are really big advantages relative to these big behemoths. I mean, before we're starting Revelio Labs, I was working at IBM, and at IBM, they have so much scale, but it was very hard to get things done. Like a lot of things had to go right, even for small changes to get made. And when I was starting this company, a lot of people, I'm sure you got this all the time. They just said, "Oh, why can't X company do what you're doing? Why can't LinkedIn do this? Why can't Google do this?" And I just kind of felt like these guys can't even set up a meeting. Like I was just like that is it's very hard for companies to adapt, deceptively hard. I think it seems like, all right, they have all the money in the world. They can hire whoever they want. They can build a team to do whatever they want. But then you get into the politics and you say, oh, well, someone's going to want to own this and someone's going to squash it. And there's territorialism and there's process and there's safety and there's all these considerations that they have to, you know, think ahead on that are just going to, slow things down to a halt. So I think that like nimbleness, it's like a cliche. The small companies are more nimble, but I don't know. I believe it. I think it's like very visible, and I got to imagine that is an advantage in a world where changes are happening more frequently, and like work is being done in new ways, and more adaptation needs to happen more fluidly.
I'm curious what you think of exactly to that point. When you're saying that, what I was thinking of is that historically, as a species, we've evolved to live in tribes. And the tribes were, I don't know, 50 people, 150 people, whatever, like, yeah, there's Dunbar's number or that theory
Yeah,
around how many people
150.
yeah,
Yeah,
like 150, like, in a village, but even those numbers seem to be appealing to us. You still know everybody. Maybe even, like, 150 is kind of a lot. Maybe, like, 50 people actually are I would enjoy working with, like, 50 people on a regular basis and no more than 150 because at that point, things get too complicated. I'd be I don't know. I don't know if people enjoy working in a 10,000 person company besides the fact that it's just like they have a lot of power. But beyond that, like how many people do you actually even know within JP Morgan or whatever your company tends to be? And so if you give people a choice to say how many people would you want to work with, assuming you can still conquer the world and do as much revenue as you possibly can, but you can choose how many people you want in your organization, like will we tend to go for numbers that just feel friendlier and cozier to us?
yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so this Dunbar's number, the way I always interpret it, and I don't really know the research around it so well. But the way I always interpret it, it's like how many people can you have in your orbit, full stop, and that kind of includes, um, your work network and your personal network. So, I don't know if it's actually 150. I think they got that from like, you know, chimpanzees or something. But whatever it is, let's say there's some number out there where people can like only handle so much like, you know, so many relationships. then, if we do believe that, then your work network kind of crowds out your personal network, or those things start merging to some degree. So if you can, if we have options of whether we'd like to exist in a big tight network, you know, I want to say big and tight as kind of things that go together, because you could work at a huge company and really only interact with 5 people at that company, or you could work at a big company and be kind of, you know, embedded in that system, in that culture, in that community. So, but let's say we have that as an option where you can be embedded into a company and have that be your primary network. And then on the side, you have family and friends and, kids, friends, parents, or whatever it is, So basically not work. And I would guess that people would prefer to have kind of like, relationship budget go to outside of work rather than be within work. So I wonder if there's some disintermediation that can happen through technology as well. I mean, you and I are both in the alternative data community. And I think of that as like such a good example of a very tight community. There's like a few events every year, and you go there and you see all your old friends and everyone you've been seeing for the last bunch of years, and everyone just knows everyone. It's a small world. And as you go to other networks, it's also a small world. Every kind of sub industry kind of has this community where everyone knows each other. And I like that community. I like the people in it. I like hanging out with them. I like going to the conferences. But if I had the choice to kind of cut that in half, if it meant that I would have closer relationships with my family and local friends, I think I would take it. No
Yeah, I love
offense
that.
to the alt data community out there.
Yeah, right. No, totally, and I wonder, yeah, like, I wonder if this in some ways will push people more local, like, if this could this be the rebirth of the local economy, or that's we had in the villages, right, where you interacted both economically and in a friendly way with the butcher, with all the other folks there, and it tends to be a more fulfilling, joyful experience versus I like the way you put it about using up your relationship like resources on work versus personal, and how you just don't have time. And I definitely am guilty of that myself, where I don't spend nearly as much time with my friends as I do with people at work or yeah, with the alt data community.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also something to be said. The counter to that is that I think that work and leisure are kind of bleeding together in some way. Work is a lot more enjoyable than it was before. We're not working in sweatshops. We get to hang out with our colleagues and friends and brainstorm with them, and it's fun. And I really like my work colleagues, and I mean, I consider them friends, and that is one community that I would love to invest more time in, do more with, if I can curate that well. Like if companies become places where there are people that, you know, want to hang out together. I mean, I think they are already becoming that, but if they become even more like that, then I'd say maybe that's great. Maybe we should be, hanging out with our work communities to the extent that they're fulfilling communities and close friends, or we could hang out locally, with our friends and neighbors, which gives us a different type of fulfillment. But it does seem like as we get more affluent and productive as a society, we'll be able to make choices that align to our personal preferences more. I mean, there's a Warren Buffett quote. I'm going to butcher it, but it says something along the lines of like, the best thing about having a lot of money is that you don't have to work with assholes, or you don't have to work with people you don't want to work with. And I think about that a lot, because I think, well, okay, I don't have the wealth of Warren Buffett, which means that like sometimes I have to work with assholes, and like that just is how it is. And it would be very nice to not have to. Like that. That is a form of like consumption. That is a way to kind of use your wealth for some social priorities that I would imagine people would do as they have more options.
I love that you think about a lot of this conversation has been philosophizing about the future of work, and that is a big part of your job, whether you're teaching or at Revelio, but you also have the benefit of working with data. So it's not just whatever theory that Mate comes up with on the other end of the line. It's like, what does the data actually show us about what's happening with the future or the current state of work? I'm curious how you think about that side of it, like what you have seen. Maybe even tell us a little bit more about what Revelio does and some of the data sets that you guys have, and then how you tie the data to some of these like fun philosophical or just current event type piece of information that need to be validated.
Yeah, that's the fun part. That's where it gets more enjoyable. So we're a labor market data company. You know, we get any information on the internet related to employment. So that could come from profiles, job postings, you know, employee sentiment ratings, layoff notices, immigration filings, anything out there related to employment. So if you have an online profile like a resume, you know, you can see when someone starts a job, what their title is, the bullet points of what they say when they leave that job, where they go next, you know, so much information. I mean, it's like how everyone spends their lives. I mean, this is like all digitized. Obviously, that has to be like classified to things like occupations and skills and work activities and seniority levels and companies. And like, there's a lot of data processing to do, of course, as most data sets, you know, require. Although I do think this one is like especially messy because it's all kind of free text, and digital exhaust. So getting a handle on that data is useful in understanding firms. You know, what are companies doing? What are they investing more in? You know, is there a spike in the attrition rate of some key role? Maybe that's a sign things aren't going well. You know, there's a lot that you can uncover about like what's happening inside a company. And then, you know, how we sort of tie this to what's happening in the world, you know, there's also a lot of fun things to do there. I tend to think that there's really nothing that happens within a company, within an economy that doesn't somehow manifest itself through the workforce, through employees and what they do. I mean, you know, employees touch everything. So, you know, very often we'll write about some phenomenon in the news and we'll put a workforce angle on. We have a weekly newsletter that we put out about like things that we're seeing, you know, employment related data that are just interesting to the masses, you know, that are just something that is like fun to look at. And as we think about this future of work angle, you know, yeah, I'll tell you one recent analysis that I did, which I thought was really fun. So we have this taxonomy of work activities. So these are really distinct from occupations and skills. But basically, the way we think about it is that a job is essentially a bundle of work activities. You get hired to do a job, you get hired to do a set of things. Those are not skills. The work activities are the attributes of the job, the skills are the attributes of the person. So like really distinct concept. Of course, skills are inputs into completing the work activities. They're related, of course. But if we see, you know, what technology does is it displaces work activities. Does not have any direct effect on skills. But it does have a direct effect on work activities and on occupations because occupations are a set of work activities. So what we one thing we thought that would be interesting is to track how much the set of work activities in the economy changes. So that is like, is the work we are doing today in the world, the total stock of work done in the economy, is that different than the total stock of work that was done a year ago or the total stock of work done 10 years ago? I mean, is the stuff we do different than what we used to do? And that is a measure of like how much things are changing. And, we do see that there's some times when work changes a lot, when the total amount of work changes a lot. But then another question we thought that I thought was interesting is given that change, how much of that change happens between occupations? So how much is explained by just like, oh, well, there's more nurses and less engineers and more, just the difference in the composition of jobs versus within occupation. So every job actually does different things. The things, if you're a data scientist today, you're doing very different things than if you were a data scientist 5 years ago. If you are a product manager today, you have an unrecognizable job than being a product manager however long ago. So the occupations themselves transform. I thought like you can really do this decomposition. You can say, all right, how much of the change in the economy happens across occupations? How much of it happens within occupations? And maybe this is unsurprising, but the vast majority of changes in work happens within occupations, like 80%, which I think is so notable because so much of economics research is about, looking at increases in this job, decreases in that job. We think about, the transformation of an economy through the lens of what happens between occupations, really because that's where the data is. There's really only government data is produced at the occupation level. It's not produced at the task level. No one has that. No one thinks about it that way. But that is kind of how the economy operates. Firms need to produce tasks. They have to get work done. It doesn't really matter whether that happens, by changing someone's job, by hiring different types of people, through a vendor, through, a freelancer, whatever it is, as long as the work gets done, that's the ultimate objective. So I think I'm excited about being able to measure, economic transformation through the transformation of work activities that get done and what that means for economic research in the future. So I think that's an exciting path for us.
How how does that tie to productivity if the same role is changing a lot? I imagine, not like it's almost like a productivity is a net metric, whereas the change in the role is a gross metric, where you could be changing your role a ton year over year, but not all of that is resulting in more economic productivity because some of it is, yeah, you're just even experimenting with new things, like even all the AI stuff we discussed. Like everyone's probably now putting in like AI type things in their job descriptions, but that doesn't necessarily lead to additional productivity. And I'm wondering if you overlay like productivity into this, does that give you like a more nuanced metric of like how much are people spinning their wheels in their jobs as they're trying to figure out ways to become more productive?
Yeah, I mean, I I think that work transformation is kind of downstream of productivity or kind of downstream of expected productivity. I mean, here's one way to think about it. Let's say you're a manager and you are managing people. Let's say you're a middle manager. Your job is kind of to understand the needs above you, sort of, understand the priorities for the company, for the group, whatever kind of sits above you in an org chart. You have to like understand what the priorities are and how those are shifting. That's a fluid process. There's always changing business priorities, client needs, all this stuff. And then what's happening beneath you in the org chart? The people that you manage. What are they working on? How well are they doing? Who's good at this? Who's interested in this? Who's not good at this? Who's not interested in this? How people need to work together and coordinate and collaborate and all that. So you're kind of a matcher in like in you're essentially negotiating between a fluid set of requirements from the business and a fluid set of capabilities from a team. And I think your job is essentially to reconfigure work. The job of management, standing on one foot, is to be, a job designer. Is to be in the business of reconfiguring what people do, or helping people reconfigure their own jobs, and that is to kind of meet the needs of the business, which I think is about productivity. So I think you're only reconfiguring stuff for the purpose of getting to those business objectives. So I think this process of work reconfiguration is a complicated process, but that happens through the manager, through the employees, through their interests, through this whole complicated negotiation, which ultimately, if it's done well, results in better performance toward those business objectives, which is productivity. So I think of that as productivity being the 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 draw, the purpose of doing this reconfiguration.
Yeah. But I guess, yeah, then that begs the question of like how efficient is that reconfiguration? And are some businesses like more efficient at it than others?
I certainly think so. I mean, this kind of goes back to this idea of like, adaptive small organizations versus like very procedural organizations. I think of my own company, and we're like 80 people or so. I know your company's probably in the same boat, where the needs change all the time. And, some client has a new request, there's some, thing that gets messed up in one of the pipelines or whatever. We're constantly thinking like, all right, we got to deal with this. Who's got the bandwidth? Who's got the skills to do it? Who's like the right person? We're every day is a discussion of like, who should take this on? How should we prioritize? How, who should work on what? And that, for the most part, has nothing to do with technology. It's just being in an adaptive, dynamic organization. And in these procedural companies where, every worker is like essentially a cog in an assembly line, that doesn't happen. It also doesn't happen in areas where there's very strict occupational licensing, where people are really only allowed to do a very narrow set of tasks. So I think that procedure and strict licensing requirements are kind of the enemy of transformation, and the adaptive organizations are going to be the ones that are able to reconfigure more flexibly.
Super interesting. I feel like we should have this conversation more often because there's a lot of applications to what's happening in the workplace. Maybe this is more of a recurring thing if you're open to it.
Yeah, in 6 months, we'll learn that we were wrong about everything.
Yeah. And really, yeah, and but really it obviously it's fun. It's something very topical. People are talking a lot about this a lot. And I guess on that note, instead of thinking about the very far future, how are you thinking about the future of your work for this week? What's next for you in the next couple of days?
Okay, good question. I mean, yeah, pushing toward releases. I mean, I think getting, always trying to just level up the product and the software, so that's like one priority
What
that
are
is
some of the features that you're hoping to launch or you wish you were gonna launch soon?
well, on the more kind of promotional side. We spoke about this earlier. I launched a new podcast, so now we're podcast buddies, and that's also just recording some episodes for that. It's called The Economics of Work. So that's also kind of a new initiative, and trying to learn how to do that well, which will probably take some time, but that's a priority. And then in terms of other things, nothing major. I mean, actually, one thing we're working on the product side, we're trying to do more economic impact and more scenario planning. Like right now, we're a data company, but we don't really, everything we report is very descriptive. What is happening to this company, this role, like what is descriptively happening? We haven't really been in the business of scenario planning. If you do a certain thing, if you know do this layoff, or invest in a new plant in this county or something, what are the outcomes that you can expect? What are the expectations? And then you can compare different scenarios. So that's something that I think would be quite useful for understanding organizations, understanding geographies, and
Is it
making
also
better.
do you envision even governments wanting to look at that? If we bring in X company into our town, what are the second order effects there?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Yeah, I think that's probably the primary users initially. It's like local governments who are thinking, if I mean, one is like, should I allow the construction of this data center or something? What will happen to this or that? And then if they do want to, what are the workforce implications? Do we have people we need? Do they have the right skills? Do we need to invest in training programs? Do we need to, incentivize, new housing construction, whatever? How do we actually meet the requirements of this thing that we think is a good idea?
Interesting. I can see that also being useful for investors who are thinking about if a competitor opens up a location in a certain town, what is that going to do to the labor market there, to wages, the availability of that kind of talent? Yeah, especially in places where the skills are relatively scarce and talent's limited.
Yeah,
Well, Ben, this was awesome. There's so much more that we can cover, so hopefully we'll do this again soon. But thank you so much for joining me today and thinking about what the future of our work and our lives is going to be like.
for sure. Likewise. Yeah, looking forward to the next time.